General Joulwan, as you know, is in the autumn of an extremely distinguished military career, 36 years in the Army. He spent more than half that time in Europe and is here today to talk to you about Bosnia and other topics that you want to bring up to him as either the Commander-in-Chief of our European Command or as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So I turn it over to General Joulwan. It may be his last appearance here.
On what the SecDef's going to say tonight at Brookings?
Yes, we may even have a text, although I hesitate to promise it now, but we're working on it. We'll see what we can do.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. And as always, it's good to return to Washington and meet with such an august group. And I look forward to your questions. But I thought it might be useful now, a year and a half into our Bosnian mission, as the overall military commander for that operation, to give you a little update. There have been some, I know, some stories about what S4 is or is not doing. I would like to, if I can, give you a quick overview and bring you up to date with where we are, and then answer some questions that you might have. So if I can, to talk about S4, I think it's important. When we went from the implementation force, or I-4, to S4, and I briefed you on that in the past, we went to these phases. And I'll come back to this at the end, where we transitioned the force from the implementation force to S4. S4 is different than I-4 in many ways. And there are some similarities, and I'll talk about those, but the idea under S4 is provide a stable environment, and therefore we are now in phase 2. Preventing a spring offensive, maintaining the force presence in selected areas, and providing a security framework for civil agencies and for the municipal elections. At some point, and this is the point at some point I have to give to the North Atlantic Council, we will go to a reduction of the S4 force, which is about 31,000. We went from 60,000 to about 30,000. We'll reduce the force, continue compliance, and hand over some tasks to civil organizations. And then in June of '98, which is what I have now for mission completion, we will coordinate the redeployment of the forces, hand over all the tasks to appropriate civil agencies, and last S4 troops out in June of '98. That is my mission. That is not just the U.S. mission. That is what has been given to me by NATO. The S4 mission goes until June of '98. Next slide. I just wanted to show you this because this is what I briefed the NAC on, and that we have to be clear. I-4 was at 60,000. S4 is about 31,000. So we have a series of military tasks and supporting tasks to civilian agencies under I-4. When we reduce the force to about in half, we still have military tasks to selected priorities. But that meant that I wanted to make clear that we couldn't support with 30,000 what we did at 60,000, though we would try. So I had to make it clear that it was very important, I'll show you how we did that, to maintain our focus as the military side with ensuring that we could carry out those military tasks. Next slide, please. We are doing that with 34 nations, and it's important this time that it isn't just the NATO nations, but non-NATO nations as shown here. And in this 30 to 31, 32,000 force, less than 25% is U.S., 75% is NATO and non-NATO. And interestingly, on the non-NATO side, about 1/3 of the force is non-NATO. This is part of our Partnership for Peace program, where we have trained under Partnership for Peace with many of these nations over 3 years. They are now contributing in a very positive way. Another important fact is the headquarters for S4 is comprised of 25 nations, most multinational headquarters in recent history. And that is very significant, and that includes some of our partners. So the concept we had for, in the NATO side, of Partnership for Peace and Combined Joint Task Force, that theory is now in practice in Bosnia. Very important outcome for how do we look to the future in Europe, NATO's new mission, as I call it, and Bosnia is a very important part of that. Next slide. These are the key military tasks I outlined to the Council that we must be able to do. We have done that. There's been no spring offensive now in Bosnia for the last 2 years. We have deterred or halted hostilities. We do have self-defense of force protection and freedom of movement. We are contributing to a secure environment, even with less one-half the force. And we are doing joint military commissions. This is very interesting. UNTACE is the UN mission in eastern Slavonia. That's not well understood. We, in NATO and S4, provided air cover for UNTACE and also in extremis extraction if that was needed. But because of our cooperation there, as you all know, there's been a successful election now in eastern Slavonia, and so that has been a very, very successful outcome. And we are watching this very closely in terms of controlling the airspace over Bosnia-Herzegovina, particularly with air defense, not allowing air defense weapons to come back up. Those are the military tasks. Next slide. Here is what we've been doing under S4 for deterring, stabilizing, and monitoring. You can see what happens. And there's a lot of abbreviations here, but within our multinational divisions, there are joint military commissions that meet monthly. There are very many multilateral meetings that take place at the brigade and battalion level, and hundreds of low-level liaison meetings. I have insisted on this dialogue with all the former warring factions, and it's been reinforced at the Rome summit that this has to take place, and it has to take place at every level. And that is what has been happening. That takes a lot of time and effort, and a lot of commanders are involved in this, but it's extremely important. On ground operations, we're covering 1,400 kilometers of a inter-entity boundary, and we do the 150 patrols daily. So to carry out the military side of our responsibilities, it requires a great deal of patrolling and monitoring, which I'll tell you now is nearly 500 weapon storage sites. In other words, if you recall what I-4 did, we separated the force, demobilized their forces, and put their heavy weapons in storage areas. To make sure they stay there, we have these patrols that take place daily. So the 60,000, the 30,000, it takes an enormous effort. These patrols are from a handful up to a platoon-sized force. It depends on what occurs, but it's absolutely critical for that secure environment to be maintained that heavy weapons stay within their storage areas. And there's permission that's required when the former warring factions want to maintain or train with their weapons. In addition to that, we control the airspace over Bosnia, and we make sure that it stays clear. We fly intelligence, ground support, and other air sorties that go into Bosnia every day, plus hundreds of helicopter flights to make sure that we do the reconnaissance and we make sure that we're monitoring the area. That allows us to do the stabilization. The point I want to make here is that this is a tremendous military effort that has to take place throughout Bosnia. What we do not want to do is hunker down in some cities, Brčko, Mostar, Sarajevo, as was done by UNPROFOR, and not be able to control the countryside. We think that's what the police are there for. They ought to be conducting those operations inside the city, though we're giving an enormous amount of support to the IPTF. So this is the overview of what I mean by stabilization. Next slide, please. Now, in a nutshell, how we're supporting the Dayton Agreement, Annex 1A, and there are 10 or 11 annexes. And Annex 1A is what pertains to the military. Annex 1B is arms control, and the rest deal with civilian agencies. We have demobilized the force. We have taken their heavy weapons and their troops and put them in storage areas and barracks. and we monitor this daily. And any noncompliance is dealt with. I was just there on Wednesday. There was an attempt by one of the former warring factions to take some air defense weapons out, and they started to track NATO aircraft, S-4 aircraft. It was immediately caught by one of these patrols. Very serious offense. The bottom line of all of that, those weapons have been confiscated. Very clear signal. That's why we need to be out doing what we're doing and monitoring the countryside. Next slide. Now, I've talked about this before. That's really the responsibility of the High Representative. But as we went from I-4 to S-4, what happened is we provide the secure environment for the civilian agencies to do many of these tasks, and reconciliation, the return of refugees, demining, and I might add here a tremendous effort by S-4 to work with a Department of State, U.S. Department of State initiative. We now have a very proactive program that is very much, a great deal of promise. We have actually had more lifting of mines in the last month or so than we've had in the last year. And that's because we now have, S-4 said to the parties, you can't train unless you train to do demining. And we will have soon close to 500 deminers trained of the warring factions that will be lifting out mines. There are 3 sessions. 2 of them have been complete. 1 more will be done in June. And we will now have, as I said, nearly 500 properly trained people to demine the area, and that's done with the help of S-4. I'll talk a little bit about municipal elections, but that's really the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as is arms control. War criminals to The Hague is always a question that we get. I have very clear guidance of what I can do. There's a memorandum of understanding between the ICTY and NATO that outlines what I can do, and I have gone as much as I can, as proactive as I can in helping here. And if political will and political consensus continues to develop, we'll be glad to take any other instructions that we have. But right now, my mandate is clear. We really are working also on police enforcement with the IPTF, but police functions are the responsibility of the local parties and the International Police Task Force. We work very closely with them. This is an area that I think needs to be increased as we go further along in our operations in Bosnia. There should be a police academy graduating so many qualified policemen to standard every year. And the reconstruction and economic development is primarily the responsibility of the World Bank. So let me, if I can, leave that up and let's show you what we've done here. And I'm not going to cover all of this except on the part of economic development. This is being done by S-4 troops, engineers. I think it's over 60 bridges. We've got 4 airports ready to be open. We've opened up the railroad that links Bosnia with Ploče on the Croatian coast, 2,500 kilometers of road. These are not only U.S. engineers and NATO engineers, but Hungarians, Romanian engineers. Just a tremendous effort here. And Italians have come in, Italian military, to do tunnel work to open up the railroad. So when someone says perhaps S-4 is not as proactive, that is just not true. We have been working very hard. Our commanders at the local level, I just visited MND Southwest with the British sector. The Canadians are deeply involved, millions of dollars in the small projects, clinics, schools, etc. That's working extremely well. We are helping facilitate the efforts of many of the international agencies and the non-governmental organizations. And as I say, they're restoring schools and clinics, etc. So a tremendous effort. Much more needs to be done. And this needs to be done in a focused, coordinated way in what I call a synchronized implementation plan. But that is really the work of our High Representative and civilian agencies. I want to just show you that we are absolutely working in every one of these areas. And if you list all the 10 or 12 annexes, S-4 is involved in every one of them with some sort of personnel trying to assist and help. Next slide. In the support for Britschko, which is another issue, S4 was very, very proactive in February, and I saw the movement of forces. I visited Britschko personally to make sure that the emphasis was there when the Britschko decision was announced. Therefore, it was accepted. We have an active S4 presence in Britschko today. There's an S4 U.S. patrol or platoon on the bridge that goes over the Sava River joining Britschko with Croatia. We have a battalion located right within the zone of separation and along the IEBL, which is a kilometer or so from the town of Britschko, constant patrolling, daily coordination with the administrator there now and the IPTF, and we provide security, a secure environment for the IPTF and local police to do police functions. And these are the individuals charged to do those police functions. And it leads me back to that first part. What we don't want to do is get the military hunkered down in places like Britschko, Mostar, etc. We'll provide the secure environment. The police will do the police functions. As you recall, many of those in the past on the UNPROFOR were in these so-called safe areas, and they lost the countryside to the former warring factions. We don't want that to happen in this case. So we really need some effort here for a more robust local police and IPTF training and numbers. Next. In our support to municipal elections, I just met with Ambassador Froeck. He is very pleased. I might add, the entire North Atlantic Council last month went to Bosnia, to Sarajevo. Secretary General and I were there. We met with not only the commander of S4, but all the agencies that were involved, to include the High Representative. We also met with the presidency. And in the meeting with the High Representative and all the other agencies, each of those agencies lauded and praised the cooperation of S4. They're very pleased with that cooperation. And in fact, they marvel that we are doing the same sort of level of support to them as we did under I4, even though we have one half the force. And nowhere is that more evident than in the municipal elections. As you remember, last September, we gave an enormous amount of support to the OSCE. We're even doing more so now. We are trying to provide a secure environment, voter routes. We're also working to make sure the polling areas are secure. We've given emergency assistance, mapping. We've given personnel to this Joint Elections Operations Center, and these are key people. They are the ones that come from our CIMIC or reserve organizations, civil military officers, and they are extremely valuable for what we're doing. We're helping in printing, voter education, distribution of material. There's a great group there. It's called the Beluga Group. Now, the Beluga Group is an acronym for Belgium, Luxembourg, Greece, and Austria. That multinational group has transport, trucks and other transport. They put millions of miles on their vehicles in support of this election. So I get somewhat concerned when someone talks about what support, that there's diminution of support for the civilian agencies. We're very much involved. We're dealing air transport, communications, and we're even looking at the post-election period. I'm not sure what all the commitments will be for the election, but we are also planning, if need be, to bring in additional forces if our commanders say that's required. And I've already put an alert out to the nations, and they are prepared, if need be, if the assessment in September is there, to bring in additional forces. That, to me, is very proactive. And I must say, the ambassador responsible for coordinating this, Ambassador Bob Froeck, is very pleased with the effort we're making. Now, the way ahead. This is a very busy chart, but what I've tried to show here, how we went from I4 to the stabilization force in December of '96. We've been through phase one of that I mentioned before. We're now trying to provide this secure environment for compliance, for demining, and all the other things you can read there. And we are at this about little over 30,000. I have to report to the North Atlantic Council in June on a 6-month assessment, and I need to give them a recommendation when we go from phase 2, which is stabilization, to phase 3, which is the deterrent phase, and when will we reduce. That will be based on an analysis I will do in June. Much will depend on the elections and what support we need for the elections. But and those elections will take place in September. Also, will Britsko and Mostar be included in those elections? And we're doing that analysis now. But at some point, we will reduce the force, and the exit, according to the NATO mission to me, not any one nation, the NATO mission to me for S4, that mission ends in June of '98. So that's what it looks like, and I will be giving 6- and 12-month reviews to the North Atlantic Council. So, in conclusion, I think we're now 31,000, not 60,000. A great input from our Partnership for Peace and other non-NATO nations. We have 34 nations now contributing to the stabilization force. We have completed the military task and will maintain those military tasks of Dayton. We are proactive in our support of civilian agencies. There's an urgent need for a civilian implementation plan and truly a development of local police forces. That's going to be important. We need a comprehensive look at how we do all of this. What is the security environment going to be? How do we bring back the 200,000 refugees that Madam Ogata, the High Commissioner for Refugees, says are coming back? How do we put all that together? Police forces are a key role in all of that, but that is a civilian function. Those are given, the IPTF are given by the international community, and we need to get some rigor and some discipline in turning out qualified police forces that are in place and professional by June of '98. So I have been telling the nations of NATO and the troop contributing nations and the leadership here that we ought not to skip ahead to June of '98, but let's say, what can we do in the next 14 months? How do we create the best conditions we can in the next 14 months and not just rely and skip ahead to June of '98? If we do that, I think we can create the best conditions to make an informed recommendation of what happens in June of '98, and I think it's time to get on with it. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my quick overview. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Charlie.
General, you've already answered my first question, and that you indicated you've made no decision yet on whether to cut U.S. forces yet at the 6 months point. How many U.S. troops are there?
8,500.
8,500. And also, on the business of war criminals, you mentioned political will as you have before, and yet you seemed almost anxious for the military. You've said before that the military has no part in doing police duties, and yet you say here, we'll be glad to take any other instructions. Are you saying the military is not only prepared, but anxious to do
No, I hope I didn't leave you with that impression. But what we need to get is, if there is political will, then I think what we need to do is get that will and that clarity of mission clearly stated. We think, or at least I think, let me put it that way, that these war criminals belong in The Hague. My reaction is that this should be done by the parties themselves. That's what Dayton talks about. The parties have that responsibility. Also, what needs to be looked at are the local police, and the IPTF need to assist and help them in doing that. And if they want the military to do it, then what they need to do is have a clear mandate and instructions for that to happen.
Mr. Karadzic goes back and forth to work every day. Still, over all these months, he's never run into a bunch of NATO soldiers who recognize what his hairdo looks like. And are you guys sort of hiding?
We've heard those reports before, but I will tell you that we have checked them out. That really is not the case. I know it's nice to say that, but it's really not the case. Let me leave it at that. There is no known, that I know of, where there's been an S4 patrol or something like that that has come in contact with Mr. Karadzic that I know of. And I will tell you that he is, there is also a very large group that protects them. And so I think all of that needs to be focused and brought into proper focus. But we're not out there avoiding indicted war criminals. What I will tell you, though, is that the mandate says that if we come in contact in the performance of our duties, then we will detain them and turn them over to proper authorities, and we would engage if the tactical situation permits. Soldiers are not really trained to do that. All right. Soldiers are not really trained to do that, and so I think that if that needs to be understood, and what we would hope would happen is that the parties themselves, that the political pressure would be put on the parties themselves, as Dayton specifies, to turn them over. If they want the military to do more than that, then they have to give me the proper instructions. Yes.
On that particular matter, there was a report several months ago of the formation of a specific police force for the apprehension of these war criminals, and we haven't heard anything much about it since. Do you think that's a workable approach, or one you would favor?
Well, again, that's the political will that needs to be determined, and that needs to be decided by the nations themselves.
Could I just ask about an incident about a month ago that of a mine being planted in the path of the Pope, something that could have greatly destabilized the whole area? Do you know if that was an intention to assassinate the Pope, and who did it?
Well, the information that we have is that the mines were there. They were discovered by the local police, as I recall. Whether we could track it to an organization targeting the Pope, I'd have to say, let me take that and see if I can get some more information for you. But that it was on a bridge that the Pope would use, that much we know. But let me turn that around a little bit, if I can, in that we had, for the Pope visit, probably the best coordination that we've ever seen between the former warring factions. I mean, thousands and thousands of people on hundreds and hundreds of buses came freely across the borders and across the inter-entity boundary. So I know it can be done. And I think we need to hold them accountable, the former warring factions and the parties, to provide that sort of secure environment. And that takes not just the military, that takes the political will that says this can be done. And this was a good example, I think, of the coordination. Not one incident that I know of between any bus or anything else that was held up for any reason. Yes, in the back.
On municipal elections, part of the Dayton Agreement is that the voters from particular ethnic groups should be able to go back to their original villages.
Yes.
I see it in your bullet. You have secure environment and also voter routes. Does that mean you anticipate protecting routes by which different ethnic groups will go back to their own villages?
This is part of the coordination that we need to make sure we know what routes are going to be used, also to be free of mines, and so there is that concern, and what we don't want to do, if voters use routes that have not been cleared, and so that's part of the coordination that I think is needed between all the different agencies to include S4 in a coordinated plan. That is what we're trying to work. So I think going back, part of this is going back to minority areas to vote, and we're coordinating that with OSCE now, but we're giving it an enormous amount of intellectual help as well as security.
Do you have any sense of how many extra troops you will have to ask for to protect this?
Well, that's a question we're working right now. I hate to speculate until I know all the answer, all the requirements. But we have looked in the range of up to and including 4 to 6 battalions if it comes to that, but we're not at that stage yet. But I find that the nations I've done it with enough time. They understand the requirement. I just have to make that part of this 6-month review that I'll give in June. But we are looking forward to it.
Well, you're talking about 4 or 6 battalions.
Not sure yet. I would say that may be upwards of, I would say, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 personnel. Not sure how many Americans. It's a NATO commitment that I'm talking about. But all of that is yet to be seen. I do not want to give a number yet because we don't know all the requirements.
Since you're here with your NATO hat on, I'd like to ask you a question about Russia.
Yes.
We learned today from a secret CIA report published by the Washington Times that there have been some cases in which Russian nuclear missiles spontaneously slipped into some sort of a combat mode. What do you make of that? Can you put that into context for us, and particularly about whether it concerns you about the potential breakdown of command and control of the Russian nuclear forces?
We're looking at that. I don't have anything more than that. I think the Pentagon's trying to work on a response. We're going to look at it from the NATO side. We have been watching with some concern the storage of nuclear warheads. And for the most part, we've got some positive feedback that it's been done correctly. I think part of the NATO response in the January '94 summit was this whole issue of weapons of mass destruction and counterproliferation. And I think that's been part of our concern in NATO for some time, and that initiative is getting a large look right now.
But the conventional wisdom from the West has been that the strategic rocket forces that oversee the Russian nuclear arsenal have been taken care of, and the morale has been good, and that there's no lessening of control. These reports that we've been getting, and this is just one of over several months, seem to indicate a trend going in the opposite direction. I mean, would you still say that those are under the firm control of
Well, we're looking at that because of that report, looking at it very closely, but I would say that the reports that we have received up to this date have been that the nuclear warheads have been properly cared for. But this brings another bit of information, and we're going to assess that and look into it. Let me right here. Right.
One of your functions, obviously, one of the critical functions is the disarmament, and indications are that that's not going ahead very well, largely because no one can get the warring factions to tell how many they had to start with, so we don't know how far they're coming down. What's the status of the disarmament?
Well, here's where the clarity is required, and it is the primary function for arms control, as I tried to point out, belongs to OSCE, not to S4. We have a responsibility to make sure the demobilization and the storage of weapons and heavy in storage sites, but the negotiations for how things are counted and how that applies in the arms control field and the timing of all of that is out of Vienna and the OSCE. We have provided, we S4, at the direction of the North Atlantic Council, provided the information we have, what's in those 500 heavy weapons sites. We've given them that. But how that is negotiated with the former warring factions is really the OSCE doing that. But we are very much in support of providing the data and the information to OSCE.
Well, General, if S4 withdraws entirely by June of '98 and isn't replaced by some kind of military force, how long do you think that peace there would last? What's your best guess?
That's why, that's a good question. I would really like to say it depends on what we do in the next 14 months. If we could get some momentum behind clear objectives that we want to see, opening up of airports, of getting police, properly trained police, of really having a plan for the return of refugees, that would lead me into a better discussion of what would happen in June of '98. No one would believe what we did if 15 months ago we would say this is where we'd be in Bosnia. Very few in here would have believed that. So
15 months ago, you said you were going to be out of Bosnia.
Well, but we also said that we would accomplish certain things. We've done that. The political authorities said we're going to stay 18 more months. And so we've adapted to that. What I'm trying to get at is that let us focus on what can be done in the next 14 months. And really much of that depends on the civilian agencies. And that's why I'm saying there has to be some plan of implementation of how do you do this. And let me say that I have given a 3-star general to this agency to help in bringing back the return of refugees. Here's some attempt to say, here's a plan to do that. We also have tried to give some help on the International Police Task Force about here is a broader look at the security that's going to be required in Bosnia for some time to come. How do you do that? And we've given that information. We've tried to be as proactive as we can. But I think what's going to depend on June of '98 on what will have to remain after that is going to be dependent on what you do in the next 14 months. Yes.
There have been reports of low morale among the U.S. contingent in S4, firstly. And one of the reasons given by some people on the ground is that the United States forces are simply not able, under their rules, to take as much part in, for instance, the engineering works and the civil engagement works that you mentioned in your economic activities chart. Could you comment on that? Are U.S. troops constrained from joining in these operations?
I know of no low morale that you talk about in Bosnia. I've been there, and I'm going again. I don't see that. I see a great deal of focus on what they're doing. There have been some instances, a great deal of effort in the civil area of assisting the local populace. So I don't sense that. I see a great deal of it, for example, also in the British sector. The ODA, I guess, I'm not sure what that stands for, but it's an agency that is really actively involved in helping construct schools and clinics, etc.
But there are reports that the U.S. troops are simply not being allowed to do as much as other nations' troops are because of the terror of casualties here back in Washington.
Well, I think they're very proactive. They're building roads, they're bridges. I have not seen those reports, so I'm sorry. I have seen a very high morale, upbeat force that we have in Bosnia, and I'm very proud of what they're doing.
One more question?
Yes.
Change the subject again to the negotiation inside NATO for a new structure. Spain wants to have a sub-regional command that includes all its territory, including Canary Islands and Balearic Islands. How realistic is that, and what are the problems coordination with the Atlantic Command and the Southern Command?
That discussion is going on right now, and I think it will be decided before the summit in July. And there are several key issues there as Spain comes into the integrated structure, more into the integrated structure. How we handle all of Spanish territory is going to be important. There must be unity of command on the air and on the land, and that has to be linked to all of Allied Command Europe, which is my command. The other issue is what happens with the maritime piece, and that's where the concern is by the SACLANT, or the Atlantic Command. So that will be worked out. I am convinced that it will be worked out to the agreement of both Spain and Portugal, and will be a stronger alliance as a result of it.
Has there been any progress on the Af-South dispute?
Not that I know of.
One more, Ken, on NATO. There's a lot of optimistic reports that the deal is about made with the Russians. Can you report anything about that to us?
No, except that Secretary Solana will be meeting again with Primakov, who I think will be here. Is he coming? I think Rodionov's, I guess, coming tomorrow. But he will be meeting with Primakov. He just met with them recently in Luxembourg. I think there's a great deal of agreement. And I'm very pleased, by the way, that some of the foundation for that is what we're doing in Bosnia with the Russians. The fact that we have a liaison cell at my headquarters in Mons, Belgium. We've had a lessons learned session, the second one in Germany in April, went extremely well. They flew in a delegation from Moscow, a military delegation headed by the 3-star airborne commander. Troops came up from Bosnia, Russian and American. We are building the foundation for the future. And on that, I think a great deal of trust and confidence is coming. There are some tough issues left, what the Russians would call infrastructure. That needs to be worked out. But again, I'm convinced that we're going to work it out, and I'm very optimistic of the Russian NATO relationship for the future in Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
smarter than we were, because we wouldn't make it.
Very good point. At 9 minutes before the hour, you're listening to the Derek McGinty Show. We'll go back to our telephones and talk with Nancy in New Jersey. You're on the air, Nancy. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thanks for taking my call.
Thanks
I wanted to know whether Dr. Goodall was familiar with a work by Professor Dudley Young called Origins of the Sacred. He's a professor of literature at Essex University in England.